Okay, hey guys. We're continuing Descartes today. So last week we answered some basic questions about meditation one, what Descartes' task was, as well as some interesting stuff about math and everything else. But we're going to do a little recap of that and then get into the questions for today. So last week we talked about how Descartes in the meditations was basically trying to figure out what can we know with absolute certainty, right? What foundational belief can we hold that's so strong that it can never falter, right? Not just that it's true, but that it's necessarily true, meaning that it's impossible for it to be false. So he goes through these lists of foundational beliefs in his head, and he's like, all right, can I doubt it? And if he can doubt it, he throws it away, right? It's no good. So he talked about, well, maybe sensory knowledge can give me absolute information. He says, no, that's not true because we can doubt our senses. I can even be dreaming right now. He goes even a step further. And then he says, you know what? I could even doubt physical objects, right? Because we talked about, hey, even if it's true that I'm dreaming, which is an idea he had, even if I'm dreaming of this marker and this marker isn't real, isn't it true that there are markers out there that are real? And he says, maybe, maybe not. We have reason to doubt it, so let's throw it away. So we're getting rid of sensory knowledge, which means we are getting rid of even basic knowledge regarding physical objects, which means we're getting rid of even more basic knowledge about shapes and colors, so we can't even trust those things. And then he comes up with math, right? And this was the tricky part. He says, it really seems like 2 plus 2 is necessarily 4. 3 plus 3 is necessarily 6, but he says, wait a second, maybe God exists. And if God exists, then maybe God's infinitely bad and using all of his powers to trick us, right? To deceive us into everything. So that every time we think 2 plus 2, God is making us believe that it's 4 when in actuality it's something completely different, right? So basically, at the end of meditation one, Descartes is like, all right, this is pretty crazy. I'm getting tired. I'm thrown into such doubt I don't know what to do with myself. So he goes and leaves for the day, supposedly, and then comes back the next day. And this is where meditation 2 picks up. So the first question we had on the discussion forum was, after doubting basically everything, what is the one thing that Descartes can't doubt, and why is it that he can't doubt it? Like, what is his reasoning? So let's just do some recap here. So we have sensory information. No, that's dubitable. We have physical objects. No, we have basic physical properties. Again, shape and color. He says, no, that's dubitable. And then we have math. Which the answer is no. So by the end of meditation one, we're thrown into like almost infinite doubt, it seems. But like I said last week, even though it's going to look like at first that we're moving into this territory where we just kind of throw our hands up in the air and say, I don't know, we can't know anything. It's not actually going to be like that, right? Like that's not the goal of philosophers. The goal is to figure out what we can know so that we can have a firm grasp on reality. But we have to go through all these preliminary steps first, even though they seem daunting, right, initially. So he says, it could be true in meditation too that everything I thought previously was actually false, and maybe I'm being deceived all the time by an infinitely powerful God every time I think. Then he says, wait a second. I think I've reached the conclusion. He says, even if it's true that I'm being deceived every time I think, well, mustn't it be true that I'm thinking, period? He says, oh, I'd be onto something here. Because think about it. Let's say you believe that squares have four sides, right? Maybe you're wrong about the belief, but in order to be wrong about a belief, don't you have to first have a belief, right? In order to be deceived about your thinking, don't you have to first be thinking, right? You have to be thinking of something in order for that thing to be wrong. So he comes upon his first solid conclusion in the Meditations, which is that even though all this stuff is garbage, he knows that I exist, right? And this is tricky, because when he says I exist, you might be tempted to think he means I, René Descartes, this person with this body, living in this time period in history exists. That's not what he means. When he says he exists, he means he exists specifically as a thinking thing. Right? I exist as a thinking thing. Specifically, that can't be doubted, right? Because we absolutely can doubt that my body exists. We can doubt everything physical, actually, and we could even doubt mathematical principles. But we can't doubt the fact that some kind of thinking. And so when Descartes says that he exists, he means like there's this stream of consciousness happening, and he's identifying with this stream of consciousness. That's what he means by I, right? Not my hands, not my head, not even my brain, not my eyes, not anything, but this stream of thinking happening, right? This content of consciousness. That's what he means when he says that I exist, right? So whatever we can be deceived about, whatever we can take away, we can't take away that. And if you're skeptical of this, I mean, I invite you to try and disprove, right? It's like, can I think of a way to doubt thought? It's a contradiction, right? Because in order to think of a way to doubt thought, you have to think, and therefore prove wrong the thing that you're trying to prove in the first place. So you can't use thought to negate itself. So thought is an absolute. And this pushes us into some interesting metaphysical territory. Because so far we've just been talking about, well, mostly been talking about knowledge, right? This idea that we can know certain things maybe. But remember, knowledge is always related to reality. So if we're having an epistemological conversation, we're ultimately going to have a metaphysical one too. And so the question becomes, okay, this gives us a firm epistemic or epistemological basis, but now we have to ask, what does it tell us about metaphysics? What does it tell us about our theory of reality? Right? How do we build a firm foundation for that? And the answer has to do with this distinction we made between thinking and physical stuff. And this is very, very interesting because Descartes is going to espouse a position that we're still grappling with today. Some people think this distinction is absolute, it's obviously correct, while other people, namely those in the physical sciences, are really against these positions, right? So think about the fact that Descartes is doubting the body because he's doubting physical stuff. But he's not doubting, right, the mind or non-physical stuff, we could say, right, thought. In order for him to make this distinction, he has to first believe that these are two different types of things. And this is a really important distinction or discovery, whatever you want to call it, because there's this whole discussion in the history of philosophy, in the history of metaphysics, called the mind-body problem. If you guys looked at the key terms sheet I gave you, you would have had a chance to look that up. And the mind-body problem is this big series of questions all relating to this issue of whether or not there is a distinction between the mind and the body, right? So maybe an easier way to think about this is to think about it in terms of the mind versus the brain, right? Is the brain the same thing as your mind? Now, when we ask that question, we don't mean, does your brain have some relation to your mind? Like maybe your brain causes your mind to exist. Maybe your mind is connected to your brain and that's how your mind's connected to your body. Not that. The question is literally, are brain and mind synonyms, right? Are they the same exact thing? And Descartes doesn't believe so. He thinks there's a serious distinction between the mind and the brain. And so he arrives at this position, and this is an important term within metaphysics, which you may have come across, called dualism. Now, if you look at the word dual, you know the phrase already has something to do with two, right? Two-ism of a kind. Now, to what? What does this mean? Well, it has to do with this notion of substance. Now, when I say substance, I mean the stuff that something is made of, right? So, for example, if I had this cup of water and I said, okay, what substance is this made of? You would say, oh, it's made of glass. And then if I said, okay, what substance is this marker made of? You would say, oh, it's made out of plastic. So the really fundamental question that metaphysicians ask is, what substances compose reality? How many fundamental substances are there? Because notice, at the end of the day, even though this is different than this, because this is glass and this is plastic, if I kept asking you to reduce, you would realize, oh, they're both made of atoms. They're both made of material stuff. So reality is composed of maybe at least one substance, and that substance is material stuff, right? But remember, Descartes is a dualist, so he thinks there's something in addition to the material stuff. So we could say that dualism is this position which posits that we could say reality is composed of two substances. And you could phrase this in a number of ways. One way is to say it's made of material plus mind, right? Mind and matter. Another way of thinking about it is to say, on the one hand, you have physical stuff. I know stuff is a funny word, but I think it's easy and helpful. But then you also have non-physical stuff, right? You have the body, material bodies, and then you have thinking. And whatever thinking is, whatever mind is, it's not the same kind of thing as material objects. It can't be reduced to a set of material properties. In other words, if I asked you to give me a fundamental explanation of this marker, and you're a physicist, you could. You would say, at the end of the day, this is made up of these type of atoms and subatomic particles moving in these particular ways so as to produce these physical effects, right? And that's the marker. The marker can be reduced to that explanation. But if I said to you, can you give me a purely physical explanation of your thought? That becomes harder, because we don't mean your brain. And to understand the distinction, let me give you guys a little thought experiment. So close your eyes for a second. Imagine you are at a beach, sitting, and you have your ice cream of choice, right? Let's call it like the perfect ice cream sandwich, right? And you're just sweating, and you're really happy to eat this ice cream sandwich. And then you have this ice cold glass of water next to you. You have that, make it really vivid. Okay, you can open your eyes. Now here's the question. Where is that stuff? Where is it? I don't mean what beach are you sitting at? Because maybe you're like, I'm thinking of Wildwood, I'm thinking of Point Pleasant, I'm thinking of Asbury Park. No, I mean, think of that stuff you had, right? Your ice cream sandwich. Where does that exist? That idea of the ice cream sandwich and that glass of water. And you might say, oh, it exists in my head. I would say, okay, so if I cracked open your head and looked inside your brain, would I find the ice cream sandwich? No. So the question remains, where is that stuff? Like, what is even happening when thinking is happening? Because it seems like there's no way to trace its origins materially, or at least to explain it materially, says the Cartesian. So you might say, okay, your brain, the electrical signals and the neurological functioning and whatever, that's happening in the material brain, but that idea of the ice cream sandwich, of the beach, of the water, that's in your mind. And no matter how hard you look in the material stuff, you're not going to find it. This is Descartes' view of reality, right? That you have a brain, and that the brain has this thing called the pineal gland that connects you to the mind, the non-physical, but that ultimately these two things, although related, are distinct, right? They're of a different type. And this may not be controversial. Like, I think probably a lot of people actually, when they read this stuff, will think, oh, I guess I'm a dualist. Yeah, because I think the mind is something different than the brain, even though they're related. And especially if you're religious, you might think this, right? You say, there's the here and now, there's the physical realm, there's earth, but then there's also the spiritual realm, right? There's heaven or moksha or whatever, and this thing is non-physical. So if you're religious, you're probably some kind of dualist, and even if you're not religious, you're probably some kind of dualist. And if you're wondering what the counter view is to dualism, it's this thing called monism, right? Same idea. So dualists say reality is composed of two substances. The monists say that reality is composed of one substance. Right? And the most common form of monism, we would say, is something called physicalism or materialism, which says that reality is composed of only one type of thing, and it's the material stuff. There's no such thing as mind. There's no such thing as non-physical. And this is the dominant view in the current scientific paradigm. Right? For the scientists, there's nothing over and against the material universe. All there is whatever the Big Bang produced, whatever can be observed directly or indirectly by means of the machinery we have or will have at some point in the future. But that's it. There's atoms spinning in a void. That's it. This thing we call mind, it's just an illusion played on you by the brain. But that is not Descartes' view. All right, Descartes is a dualist. So to reiterate the first question, what is the one thing that Descartes can't doubt? It's the existence of his own mind. And by the way, this doesn't mean the existence of all our minds, because I could doubt your mind, right? You just can't doubt the thing that you have access to. So if I'm performing Descartes' experiment, I would say, I cannot doubt at all that I exist as a thinking thing. And you would say, well, I cannot doubt that I exist as a thinking thing. So it's very, on a subject basis, let's say. For any subject that is able to do Descartes' thought experiment, that subject cannot doubt itself as a fundamentally thinking subject. Right? That's a kind of a way of giving you a general principle. So Descartes can't doubt the mind, and what this shows us is that he has a dualistic view of reality. Okay, that's the first part, which is a lot to take in, I understand. But I think what I always say is this stuff is less difficult than you might think. It seems weird at first, but if you give it the chance of day and follow the logic, you're going to be like, okay, I get it. Second question, though. This was about the wax experiment, right? So after Descartes proves that he can't doubt that his own thinking exists in non-material form, he says, is there anything else I can know by means of this presuppositionless thing I'm trying to do? And he says, okay, let me take this piece of wax. And if you're wondering like what you mean by wax, it's like back in the day they didn't have, you know how you lick envelopes now to seal it, or you tape it? They didn't have that, so they just had wax. So what they would do is they would melt the wax and then like drop it on the envelope, and that's how it would seal it. But anyway, he has this piece of wax, and he says, let me examine it really, really carefully and see if I can find out some fundamental truths about reality and or knowledge just by thinking really hard about what's going on. And this is why people like John Campbell, who's a contemporary philosopher, likes to define philosophy as thinking in slow motion, because that's really what we're doing, right? It's like typically your thinking is happening at such a fast pace, right? Your mind is like a master chess player. You don't think about everything that's happening. Like, I grab the doorknob, but I don't think to myself, oh, I'm going to grab the doorknob at this velocity and turn it at this angle. You just do it, right? So what philosophy does is ask us to slow down and really think about what is happening and what caused it to happen and what follows from it and what are the definitions of these things and what's going on in terms of the relations between ideas. So he wants to do this with a piece of wax, right? To philosophize with a basic physical object. And I mean, you could do this with other physical objects, I suppose. He just chose the wax. So he says, all right, what do I know about the wax? He's going to look at the wax at two different time periods. So there's point A, and then there's going to be point B, and then we're going to compare these things. And in both situations, we are talking about the wax. He says, okay, the first thing I notice about the wax is that it is solid. I can't put my hand through it. And since it's solid, this means that if I knock on it, it makes a sound. In the same way that, this board is solid, so it makes a sound when I tap on it. He says, what else? Well, if I smell the wax, it smells sweet, right? Because it was made of like nectar and pollen and things like that. So it has a sweet smell and also a sweet taste. And also it's smooth to the touch. Right? You run your hand across it, it's very smooth and nice. And lastly, he could say, what else can we say about this piece of wax? Maybe that's good enough for now. Oh, let's call it cold, right? Because he just picked it up off his desk and he hasn't touched it, so it's like kind of cold. He says, let me see what happens to this wax, this object I'm calling wax, as I move it closer to my fireplace, right? You want to picture Descartes when he's doing this as like just hanging out in a robe and a glass of wine, trying to do this really serious philosophical stuff. So he's sitting by the fireplace and he moves the wax closer to the fireplace. And he sees a number of changes happen. He notices, for example, the thing that used to be solid is now liquid. That's different. The thing that used to make a sound when you tap on it now makes no sound. All this sweetness kind of disappeared, right? It kind of distilled out of the liquid as it was cooked by the fire. Like when you cook something and you reduce it and stuff comes out through the steam. It's no longer smooth. Right now maybe it's like sticky. It's a good way of calling it. And it's no longer cold. It's actually hot. So what do we do with this? We have this thing called wax. And it has this set of physical properties at point A. Yet it has this completely other set of physical properties at point B. But we still say it's wax. We still say it's the same wax. How is that possible? To see why this is so severe, it might be useful to, instead of using words, use variables, like basic letters or something like that. So another way of saying what we're saying is to say, okay, there's the wax, and then there's point A, and then there's point B. And so at point A, wax is, let's say, W, X, Y, Z, right? It has this property, this property, this property, and this property. It can be anything, right? It's a variable. Now, if you notice, the change is like an opposite change, right? It's not like, oh, it's still solid, but blah, blah, blah. No, it's actually the inverse, I guess we can call it, of the previous variable. So at point A, the wax is W, but at point P, the wax is not W, and not X, and not Y, and not Z. The question becomes, how is it that we can have this thing with literally a set of physically opposite properties be the same thing? Like, that doesn't make any sense. And this is a challenge to many things. It's a challenge to the idea that all our knowledge comes from our senses, this thing called empiricism, which Locke is going to talk about later in the week. And it's also a challenge to this idea that the identity of things is located in their material core. Because you might be tempted to say, when someone asks you what is wax, for example, you might be tempted to give a definition of wax and say, oh, wax is this physical thing that has solidity, sweetness, smoothness, and coldness. That would be an incorrect definition, because I would be able to show you wax that has the complete inverse of all those properties. And so we have a conundrum, because it seems like there's a contradiction here. Right? One of the most fundamental laws of logic is that A equals A. Right? Something is necessarily the thing that it is. And similarly, we have this thing called the Law of Non-Contradiction, which is to say that A does not equal not A. A thing is not and cannot be the thing that it is not. Right? You can't have A and not A simultaneously. It's like, you can't say this is a marker, but also this is not a marker. You can't say this thing I'm holding weighs more than 5 pounds, but also less than 5 pounds. It's impossible. And yet, how can we say that wax is both X and not X, or Y and not Y? Seems like it's a contradiction. And the reason it seems like a contradiction is because we're looking in the wrong place. The wax is not a set of physical properties. It can't be. And it can't be one specific set of physical properties precisely because every property changes, and yet it remains the same thing. So the essence of wax, right, waxness, what a metaphysician might say, the being of wax cannot be found in its material properties because the material properties can change in a number of ways, and yet the wax still remains. So waxness, whatever the idea of waxness is, it cannot be contingent on particular material properties. Therefore, the idea of the wax, the essence of it, the being of it, is located in the mind. Because what doesn't change when everything else changes? The idea of wax. Right? The mental representation of wax does not change. And so when we're engaged with objects and thinking about what the identity of an object is, right? What is something? That identity, that essence of that object, cannot be found in its material properties. It can only be found in the idea. And this is something that Descartes gets from Plato, who unfortunately we don't have enough time to do this semester. But if we did, you'd be able to see connections between, for example, Plato and Descartes and Aristotle and Locke or whatever. But that's basically the idea. And you see how this is a corollary or something that follows from the previous point about dualism, right? Because since Descartes is making this distinction between the material and the mental, the physical and the non-physical, this allows him to solve this problem by saying, oh, the identity of the wax, the core, right, that eidetic core, we would say, lies in the idea of wax and not in the material instantiation of wax. And again, that's because he thinks there's those two substances. Identity is not in physical substance, it's in non-physical substance, it's in thought, right? So, thinking that's basically it for today. Um, let's see. Yeah, I think that's everything, right? So, what can Descartes not doubt? His self as a thinking thing. And we talked about what follows from that. And how does this relate to the wax experiment? You see how it follows from a dualistic position, or at the very least reinforces it or something. So that's it for today. We're stopping at meditation 2. Fun fact, Descartes has more meditations. I think it's 6. Because you may be saying, wait, so all this guy proves is that thinking exists and all we can know are ideas? For now, yes. He goes on to try and prove other things like the existence of God, the existence of a good God, and the existence of the material world, right? So he does think that it exists. He just has a really long proof to get there. But all that concerns us right now is what he has to say about knowledge and what he has to say about substance, right, with regard to how many substances reality is made of. If you have any questions, like always, please email me. My number one goal is to help you guys. So if you're confused about anything, and I mean anything, please contact me, right? Because I can't help you if you don't reach out. And in addition to that, like last time, I would say look up stuff on Wikipedia to start, look up stuff on YouTube, and then go to the Palmer textbook, go to the Internet Encyclopedia or the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. You're going to find a lot of stuff because philosophers and scientists today are still trying to escape Descartes, right? We're still grappling with this guy's argument and seeing if he was right or not, right? And we're going to see some counter views in the future, right? When we do Locke, when we do Berkeley, when we do Hume, and all that good stuff. So I'll see you around, guys. Have a good day.